This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On October 27th, RCMI member and Canadian science fiction author and commentator Derwin Mak gave his annual Halloween lecture, this year on the Highgate Vampire.
So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 15th annual presentation of RCMI Halloween Night with Derwin Mak, September 27th, 2021. My name is Patricia Hind-White and I organize this event. There will be a question and answer period following this presentation and ask that you mute your mics and turn your camera off until that time. This presentation will be videotaped for educational purposes and available on RCMI YouTube. Our guest speaker this evening is Derwin Mak, and his topic, the Highgate Vampire. Derwin is Vice Chair of the RCMI Library Committee, an officer of St. John Ambulance and Order of St. John, a chartered accountant with a Master of Accounting degree from the University of Waterloo, and retired from the provincial government, where he worked in various capacities from accounting to fraud control. Derwin is a science fiction and anthology writer and won 2 Aurora Awards, Canada's National Award for Science Fiction Writing and the Alberta Book Publishing Award. In addition, also, he has the dubious honor of being the first and only person to capture a Pokemon inside the RCMI. With that, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome. And without further ado, over to you, Derwin.
Okay. Right, thank you, Pat. And the subject of tonight's lecture is the Highgate Vampire. And the Highgate Vampire, as his name suggests, came from Highgate Cemetery in North London. Right? So Highgate Cemetery in North London. Now, let's look at London in the early 19th century. Starting in the late 18th century and all throughout the 19th century, the population of London kept on expanding due to the Industrial Revolution and the economic boom caused by the growth of the British Empire. London became the most crowded, largest city in the world. There were actually more people in London than there were in Beijing in the 19th century. And this influx of workers to work in the factories and businesses of the Industrial Revolution and the empire's new economy caused a lot of overcrowding in London, right? Now, let's take a look at the population of London over the century. In 1780, there were only 750,000 people living in London, but 35 years later, that number had almost doubled to 1.4 million. And then between 1815 and 1860, a space of 45 years, the population more than doubled. And by 1900, it was a staggering 6.5 million people. Now, these people were crammed into a space that hadn't really significantly expanded since the end of the 18th century. Also, as with any other large city, the more people you got, the more people died. That's because, as the population expands, the number of residents who pass away also expands, right? Because all the living eventually become the dead. And this led to a terrible problem in London. Although the number of people who needed to be buried had expanded due to population growth and low life expectancy amongst the poor workers and a high infant mortality rate, the amount of land available to bury them did not expand since the 18th century. What available land there was limited to the churchyards, that is the burial grounds beside churches. London in the early 19th century did not have large cemeteries as we know today, right? Of the type that we know today. So this created an industry of illegal and secret burials in London. Unscrupulous undertakers and fake clergy would take money to bury people in the most unusual places. If they found any plot of land that wasn't being used, they would perform an illegal burial there. These undertakers and fake clergy were burying people in alleyways between buildings and beside pubs. If they saw an unused plot of land, no matter how small, beside a building or a factory, they would just dig a grave and bury people there. Some of these undertakers would just dump their clients into the River Thames or bury them close to the River Thames. Most of these graves were not dug very deep. So if there was soil erosion or if it rained and the soil washed away, the bodies would start popping to the surface. If they were buried close to the River Thames and there was a flood, the bodies would wind up floating down the river. This was a terrible situation, bad for public health and bad for a bunch of other reasons, right? Because nobody really wants to live or work beside an unauthorized grave. This also led to another illicit industry in London. Back then, medical schools and anatomists and scientists did not have a very good supply of bodies for dissection and scientific research purposes. So they often paid body snatchers to, dig up the graves of the recently dead and buy the bodies from them. Since London was so full of illegal and secret graves, this led to a body snatcher industry operating in London to dig up these graves and sell them. So the situation was quite dire. By 1832, Parliament realized it had to do something about the shortage of burial spaces for London's dead. So starting in 1832 and throughout the decade, Parliament began passing acts to allow private companies to build cemeteries at the outskirts of London. And this is a list of cemeteries that was built throughout the 1830s up to 1841. These 7 cemeteries got the nickname the Magnificent Seven because they were like nothing that the Brits had ever seen before in terms of attractiveness and maintenance and luxury. In 1836, an act of parliament created the London Cemetery Company. Although this company, like the other companies of the Magnificent Seven, were created by acts of parliament, they were private sector enterprises. And the London Cemetery Company was founded by Stephen Geary, an architect and civil engineer. Stephen Geary created a monument to King George IV in London, and this monument stood from 1830 to 1845. The monument was torn down in 1845, but the memory of it lives on in the name of the location where it is, because later on a railway station was built there, and that railway station was called King's Cross because there had been a monument to the king there. Right? So if you've ever gotten off at King's Cross railway station or the tube station King's Cross St. Pancras, that's why that area is called King's Cross. Stephen Geary enlisted 2 other men to help him design his cemetery, which he would call Highgate Cemetery. One of them was James Bunstone Bunning, who later became city architect of the City of London. And the other one was David Ramsay, a landscape architect most famous for designing the grounds of insane asylums and mental institutions, like this one, Hanwell Asylum. They were inspired by the Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. Père Lachaise Cemetery was like nothing the English had ever seen. It was large, it was organized, the grounds were well kept, the plots, the burial plots were laid out neatly, not just randomly, right? It was a beauty to behold. And the London Cemetery Company wanted to recreate the Père Lachaise Cemetery in London. And they did in the northern part of London. So in 1939, they opened up their new cemetery, Highgate Cemetery. And this was beautiful, like Père Lachaise. And it had many structures and burial facilities for a range of budgets. If you were extremely wealthy, you could buy a plot of land and build your own mausoleum or crypt there. If you were wealthy, but of more modest type of wealth, you could buy an existing pre-built mausoleum or crypt, like these ones. This is the Circle of Lebanon. It was a circle of mausoleums and a circle of very old cedar tree, right, which was nicknamed the Cedar of Lebanon. Hence, these mausoleums were called the Circle of Lebanon. If you were more middle class, you could buy a plot of land and then also pay for a monument to be built there. And there were also plots of land for very cheap budgets as well for the lower classes. The range of prices was quite extensive. For the low income groups, they could buy a plot for £5. Most of the middle class could buy their plots of land for £14. Now, bear in mind that to put these prices in perspective, at that time, the average wage of a person of London's lower class was £1 a year. So £5 was not cheap, but at the same time, it did offer a more dignified burial than what the elite, fake clergy and illegal undertakers were doing by just burying people in random places where they found them. Like many other buildings of that time, the buildings and structures of Highgate Cemetery were influenced by the architectural trends of the day, especially the fascination with ancient Egypt. Right? This fascination had grown out of Napoleon's campaign to Egypt years earlier. This is the Egyptian Gateway and Egyptian Avenue at Highgate Cemetery. In that corridor, on both sides of the corridor, are burial vaults for the clients. And Highgate Cemetery also had landscaped gardens for people to stroll for their leisure on their times off and during the weekends. Today, some of us might think of cemeteries as being an unusual place to hold a picnic or to go for a recreation. But in the 19th century, many people did go to the so-called rural cemeteries for their recreation. Public parks were not common yet. So the cemeteries that were built at the outskirts of large cities tend to also double as public parks. You may remember from one of my previous lectures about Mary Shelley and Frankenstein that Mary Shelley and Percy Bysshe Shelley would often go on dates in a cemetery, right? So cemeteries doubled as public parks back then. Another innovation of Highgate Cemetery was that it was non-denominational. Anyone could be buried at Highgate Cemetery. Before the Magnificent Seven Cemeteries were built, most of the available burial spaces were churchyards belonging to the Church of England, and they did not want any non-Anglicans buried there. So there was always a problem trying to find burial spaces for people who were not Anglicans. Although most of Highgate Cemetery was consecrated for use of Anglicans, 2 acres was set aside to be used by persons of any religion or denomination. I mean, this was especially beneficial to the Catholics, who were a minority, but not necessarily a small minority in London at the time. Highgate Cemetery was so popular that it started to run out of room by 1854, and the London Cemetery Company bought more land across the street being Swains Lane. And since this land was east of the original plot part of the cemetery, it got called the East Cemetery, and the original part was called the West Cemetery. So here's a photograph of Swains Lane. It comes from the website of David Ferret, president of the British Psychic and Occult Society, and we shall hear more about him later. Unfortunately, Highgate Cemetery began to decline in the 1930s. By then, both sides of the cemetery were starting to run out of land. And much of its income had been from selling of burial plots, but they were starting to run out of burial plots to sell. So the income of the cemetery declined. And that led to, cutting back on maintenance costs and laying off of staff. Also, after Highgate Cemetery had always counted on relatives or families of the deceased to come and take care of their relatives' graves, and also in that way help with the maintenance of the cemetery. But over 100 years, many of the families had either died off or moved away from London. So there were not that many people left to take care of the cemetery by the 1830s. Highgate Cemetery really started to suffer a drastic decline in the 1840s, with the land being unkept, right, because of lack of funds. And it became overgrown with plants and weeds, and the graves and monuments became victim to vandals who would go in there and desecrate the graves and push over the stones or deface them or try to destroy them. In 1960, the London Cemetery Company went bankrupt. Another company, the United Cemetery Company, bought Highgate and ran it for 15 years, but could not make a profit out of it. Then in 1975, some local residents formed a nonprofit organization called the Friends of Highgate Cemetery Trust and bought the cemetery from the United Cemetery Company. The Friends of Highgate Cemetery managed to turn the cemetery around. It raised the funds to have proper groundskeeping and repair the monuments and buildings, and also make sure that it is properly maintained. And so Highgate Cemetery, the Friends restored Highgate Cemetery to its former glory. Today, plants and wildlife are allowed to grow with minimal human interference in the West Cemetery, which also serves as a nature preserve. Now, I say minimal human interference, but that's not completely with the lack of human interference. They do make sure that graves don't get overgrown with weeds and plants, and they do make sure that the pathways are cleared for pedestrian traffic. Burials still continue in the East Cemetery, but space is limited. The government organization Historic England lists over 70 individual Highgate monuments on the National Heritage List for England. And here, Historic England also lists Highgate Cemetery as a Grade 1 park. Now, in contrast, Buckingham Palace is listed as a Grade 2 park, which means it's listed lower than Highgate Cemetery. Today, Highgate Cemetery is the most exclusive cemetery in London. A plot there will cost you £20,000. It also earns revenue from movie shoots. One recent movie that was filmed there was Fantastic Beasts: The Crimes of Grindelwald, one of the spin-offs of the Harry Potter franchise. In that movie, Highgate Cemetery was used as the Père Lachaise Cemetery in London. In 2019, before the pandemic broke out, 103,290 visitors visited Highgate. There is an admission fee, so these visitors generated revenue of £569,976. Unfortunately, space is running out at Highgate again. The cemetery estimates it will be full by 2023. Therefore, there's a private member's bill for grave renewal at Parliament right now. Now, what is grave renewal? By grave renewal, Highgate Cemetery aims to look for graves that are older than 75 years old. And if the family of the deceased cannot be found, or if the family can be found and consents to it, they will dig up the body, dig the grave deeper, lower the body deeper than it was before, and then use the space above and sell the plot again so that more people can be buried above the original occupant of the grave. Also, they've discovered that there are graves that were sold in the 19th century but were never used. If the families of the purchasers can't be found, Highgate will resell those plots. This bill has passed third reading at both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and is now in the consideration of amendment stage. What that means is that amendments that were suggested at both the Lords and the Commons are now being inserted at the House of Commons, and then the Commons will send it back to the Lords for approval. And if the Lords approve the amendments, then it gets royal assent. So this is the status of the private members bill as of September 15th, 2021, last month. There are 170,000 people buried in about 53,000 graves at Highgate. No one knows the exact number of people or the exact number of graves, right? And there are some famous people buried here. In the West Cemetery, Group Captain Hugh Wilson is buried there. And now that's Hugh Wilson wearing the RAF uniform. On the left there, he's meeting another RAF officer, Eric Greenwood. He's famous for being the first person to fly faster than 600 miles per hour. Also buried in the West Cemetery is Major General Herbert Benjamin Edwards, the hero of Mouton. That's where he defeated the Sikhs at the Second Anglo-Sikh War. Also in the West Cemetery is Tom Smith, a confectioner and the inventor of the Christmas cracker. Right? So if you ever pulled one of those crackers at Christmas time, Tom Smith invented those. Also in the West Cemetery is Elizabeth Siddall, a famous model, artist, and poet of the 19th century. There are celebrities in the East Cemetery as well. Tim Pigott-Smith, an actor. You may have seen him as Ronald Merrick, the Indian Army officer in The Jewel in the Crown. And also buried in the East Cemetery is Douglas Adams, the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Now, the most famous grave in Highgate Cemetery is Karl Marx's grave. This is the most visited grave at Highgate. Lots of people come there. Members of the Communist Party from all nations of the world come here to pay their respect to Karl Marx. Right? And it's an impressive grave. This is the grave of Karl Marx, and it's not just him there. His wife, his daughter, his grandson, and their housemaid are also buried underneath this monument. And originally, Karl Marx had a very simple flat stone grave marker. But in 1954, the Communist Party of Great Britain moved his body to its current location. And 2 years later, the Communist Party erected this impressive monument over his grave. The British communist sculptor, Lawrence Bradshaw, designed and made it. And it's a granite block with a marble plaque. And it also has this large bronze bust of Karl Marx. Now, there must have been a reason why Lawrence Bradshaw wanted to make it out of granite, and that's probably because he might have anticipated that it would also become the most vandalized grave at Highgate Cemetery. It's frequently attacked by vandals. In 1960, someone drew 2 swastikas in yellow paint on it and wrote messages on it saying that Karl Marx was a collaborator with the notorious Nazi Adolf Eichmann, which would have been impossible because Adolf Eichmann was born 23 years after Marx had died. In 1970, on 2 occasions, people planted bombs, including a pipe bomb, on the grave and tried to blow it up. Neither explosion did any serious damage to it, though some people noticed that the bus seemed to tilt slightly to the left, of course, to the left, after one of the explosions. In 1979, when I visited Highgate Cemetery as a teenager, someone had painted a red swastika on the granite block, right? And on another occasion, someone tried to saw off the nose of the bust, but gave up because it turned out to be solid bronze. In 2019, the grave was attacked twice in 2 weeks in February. On February 4th, someone attacked it with a hammer and managed to chip off some of the marble on the marble plaque. And on February 15th, someone painted these messages on it. Since these incidents in 2019, Highgate Cemetery has installed a security camera to watch the Karl Marx grave constantly, so to try to discourage people from vandalizing it. In 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto. And the first sentence in the Communist Manifesto is a anticipate that about 90 years after he died, an actual specter would come to haunt Highgate Cemetery. In the 1960s, something evil came to the cemetery. In 1963, on Sween's Lane near the North Gate, a couple saw a tall, dark figure floating above the railing. When they screamed, the figure disappeared. And in 1963, again, a dog walker saw a tall, dark figure slide over a wall and disappear. In 1967, two schoolgirls walking on Swains Lane saw a dark, ghostly figure rising from an open grave. The girls screamed and the figures disappeared. Again, later in 1967, another couple saw a tall, dark figure on Swains Lane. When the girls screamed, the creature disappeared. Throughout the 60s and early 70s, people also found animals like foxes drained of their blood with puncture wounds in the cemetery. Unwanted visitors also came to Highgate in the 1960s. People were finding occult symbols painted onto the graves and in the vaults, right? And this led to speculation that Satanists and occult people were meeting at Highgate Cemetery, right? Here's a photograph of an occult symbol painted on the floor of Corey Wright's vault, right? Again, this photograph comes from David Farrant's website. I'll get to David Farrant shortly. In 1968, at a nearby cemetery called Tottenham Park Cemetery, a grave desecration occurred. So I will quote from the London Evening News of November 2nd, 1968. On the night of Halloween 1968, a graveyard desecration by persons unknown occurred at Tottenham Park Cemetery in London. These persons arranged flowers taken from graves in circular patterns, with arrows of blooms pointing to a new grave, which was uncovered. A coffin was opened and the body inside disturbed. But their most macabre act was driving an iron stake in the form of a cross through the lid and into the breast of the corpse. So this is a very disturbing incident. It sounds like something right out of a vampire movie, like this movie, Dracula, Prince of Darkness. Due to these incidents, Highgate Cemetery got a very sinister reputation in the 1960s. And of course, that attracted Hammer Films, which was famous for making horror movies in the UK in the 60s and 70s. Hammer Films filmed one of its Dracula movies, Taste the Blood of Dracula, at Highgate in 1970. Here's a scene from the movie. And in 1969, David Farrant became interested in the incidents at Highgate Cemetery. Who is David Farrant? Well, David Farrant is the gentleman wearing the tuxedo and the bow tie presiding over this Wiccan initiation ceremony. David Farrant called himself an occultist, a Wiccan high priest, and he was president of the British Psychic and Occult Society. He founded the society. And Farrant's theory was that he thought that a ghost haunted Highgate Cemetery, though he would later change his mind and think it was a vampire. On December 24th, 1969, Christmas Eve, David Farrant camped in the cemetery and allegedly saw the vampire. He says the vampire tried to hypnotize him, but he escaped. On February 6, 1970, Farrant wrote a letter to the local newspaper, the Hampstead and Highgate Express, saying that he had seen a gray figure gliding through the cemetery. Following this media report, other residents said that they had also seen this figure, that it had blood red eyes and glided in the air. Here's a photograph of David Farrant in the cemetery in the early 70s. It's unusual. He's holding a Bible and a crucifix. Although David Farrant claims to have abandoned Christianity and taken up Wicca, he knew how to play the traditional vampire hunter for the newspapers and the TV crews, right? So, traditional vampires always have to dress in, Victorian clothes and carry Bibles and crucifixes and wooden stakes. So he knew how to dress the part. David Farrant became popular with the Hampstead and Highgate Express, a newspaper which the readers nicknamed the Ham and High. Right? He became popular in the tabloid press because he was now their vampire hunter. Here's a photograph of David Farrant discovering another disturbed grave at Highgate. I think some of these photographs were staged for the media. And his vampire hunt played out in the Ham and High, right? So he was front page material for this newspaper. Look at the headline. There's a vampire walk in Highgate. But he wasn't going to be alone for long because another vampire hunter showed up at Highgate Cemetery. And this was Bishop Sean Manchester. Bishop Manchester was a bishop of the old Roman Catholic Church, which is not to be confused with any church recognized by the Pope in Rome. The old Roman Catholic Church is the result of a schism in the Roman Catholic Church in Utrecht, Netherlands. I think it occurred in the 1600s. But afterwards, the old Roman Catholic Church had schism after schism, and then schismatic factions had their own schisms. So today there's actually several, countless denominations that call themselves the old Roman Catholic Church, each with their own clergy, sometimes different ideologies. And so sometimes if you meet different clergy from the old Roman Catholic Church, they might not have any relationship to each other. And some of these old Roman Catholic Church denominations are quite small. I've never found any evidence that Bishop Sean Manchester ever had a chapel or church or cathedral or ever held any regular services. So it's quite likely that he was the only member of his own old Roman Catholic Church. Bishop Sean Manchester also said he was an exorcist, a vampire hunter, and a descendant of Lord Byron. Of course. In December 1969, Manchester interviewed one of the two schoolgirls in the 1967 incident, and this girl had been having nightmares and ill health. Manchester knew that she had two small wounds in her neck. Aha, there's the evidence that a vampire was on the loose. So he filled her room with garlic and bags of salt, and her health improved. On February 27th, 1970, Manchester told the Hampstead and Highgate Express that the vampire was a 15th century Wallachian king of the vampires who practiced black magic, and that this vampire king's followers had brought his coffin to London in the 17th century, that is 200 years before Highgate Cemetery was built. And years of recent activity by Satanists and occultists had awakened this king vampire. If this story sounds suspiciously familiar, it should, because it's almost exactly the plot for Bram Stoker's Dracula. However, even though it sounded like it was something plagiarized from Bram Stoker, the Hampstead and Highgate Express reported it as if it were serious news, right? And the readers just loved reading about it. Hence, Sean Manchester and David Farrant became the fearless vampire hunters of Highgate Cemetery. This is a typical headline from the newspaper at this time. Why do the foxes die? The wild foxes of Highgate Cemetery were just dying in high numbers. Obviously, a vampire was sucking them of their blood. This is an unusual photograph because it shows Manchester and Farrant cooperating in their vampire hunt. Right? And I like that Manchester changed his hairstyle over the years. In this particular photograph, he looks like he's wearing one of the Beatles hairstyles. Right? But Sean Manchester and David Farrant Their cooperation would not last for long, as we shall see. On Friday, March 13th, 1970, the local ITV news station, which would have been London Weekend in the late afternoon of Friday, interviewed David Farrant and Sean Manchester about the Highgate Vampire. And David Farrant announced that he was going to go to the cemetery that evening and look for the vampire. Of course, there's no better time to go looking for a vampire than Friday the 13th. And he did go there, but Sean Manchester and ITV News followed him there as well. A lot of people had seen this news report in the early evening, and they went to the cemetery too. And at least 100 would-be vampire hunters turned up at Highgate Cemetery. The police found out this was going on and sent 40 police officers there to keep people out of the cemetery. But these 100 vampire hunters pushed their way through the police line, broke through the gates, and climbed over the fence. And here's a newspaper photograph of people entering Highgate Cemetery. Thus, the great vampire hunt began. After March 13th, the Sean Manchester said he had previously followed a psychic sleepwalking girl to a particular catacomb at Highgate. And on that night of Friday, March 13th, he returned to that catacomb with some friends. They lowered a rope through a hole in its roof and entered the catacomb. There they found a black wooden coffin that did not match the others in the vault. Bishop Manchester wanted to open the coffin and stake the vampire through its heart, but his friends reminded him that British law did not allow him to open a coffin and stake the body. Disturbing human remains is illegal. So he sprinkled holy water, garlic, and salt in the coffin, performed an exorcism, and left. Then on August 1st, 1970, yet another horrible incident happened at Highgate. On that day, the charred, decapitated corpse of a woman was found near a catacomb. Right? Now, August 1st is also a very important day because it's Lammas Day. The Lammas Day is a British Christian festival where people take loaves of bread to church. It's obviously a sort of harvest ritual, but it's not strictly Christian. It actually has origins in a harvest festival that predates Christianity. Its origins lie in pagan pre-Christian England. So the police suspected that occultists or Satanists had dug up that body and used it in a ritual. When David Farrant found out about this grave desecration, he returned to Highgate Cemetery with a crucifix and a wooden stake to hunt for the vampire. By now, the police were patrolling Highgate Cemetery regularly, and they arrested Farrant for being in an enclosed space for an unlawful purpose. But the judge dismissed the case and Farrant walked free. Sean Manchester, not to be outdone by David Farrant, returned to Highgate as well in August. And this time he claimed that he and some fellow vampires had entered another crypt in the daytime and saw the same black coffin that they'd seen on March 13th. Now, these coffins don't usually just move from place to place on their own. So of course, this was more proof that there was a vampire in the area. This time they opened the coffin and found the vampire. Again, Manchester wanted to drive a stake through his heart. And again, his companions reminded him that interfering with human remains would violate British law. So they set out for an exorcism using 7 crucifixes, 4 white candles, and 7 cups of holy water in a ceremony carried out by 4 men and a woman. On October 15th, 1970, the BBC interviewed David Farrant on its news program 24 Hours. Unlike the Hampstead and Highgate Express and ITV News, the BBC was not entirely sympathetic to David Farrant. Although they did let David Farrant talk about his theory that a vampire was on the loose in the cemetery, the BBC sided more with the supervisor of the grave diggers, who thought that all these incidents of grave desecration and vandalism and dead animals were being caused by vandals and other troublemakers, not by vampires or ghosts or other supernatural monsters. So, the BBC was definitely not that sympathetic to David Farrant or the other vampire hunters. That didn't deter David Farrant from going back to the cemetery. By now, David Farrant had changed his mind again, and now he thought that the evil being was a ghost. So he brought a medium to Highgate Cemetery to contact the ghost. And they performed a ritual using incense and candles. Well, unfortunately, the press interrupted one of his rituals. But then at another ritual, something grabbed the medium's throat and choked her. Later, the manager of a nearby pub saw a strange menacing figure and claimed his hair had turned white from the horror of seeing this monster. More terrible and unusual incidents occurred at Highgate through the 1970s. In 1971, people found a charred, headless, exhumed corpse with a wooden stake through its chest. And through the 1970s, there were more incidents of damaged and overturned tombstones, open graves, and dead animals. And the animals were often drained of all their blood and thrown onto the graves. By now, the police and residents had had enough of these incidents at their cemetery. They considered the vandals to be a nuisance, of course, but now they also considered the vampire hunters to be nuisances as well. The vampire hunters had long outlived their entertainment value. There was also a growing rivalry between David Farrant and Sean Manchester. They may have started out as colleagues, but their partnership broke down very quickly. And they began writing to the editors of the Hampstead and Highgate Express to accuse each other of incompetence. Both of them claimed the other was not good enough to find the vampire. And they also questioned each other's skills and expertise on occult matters. This rivalry grew so bad that they challenged each other to a duel, right? On April 13th of 1974, right? I can't read the date on my own screen, right? So they challenged each other to this duel at Parliament Hill in Hampstead, but they canceled the duel. That didn't stop them from challenging each other to duels throughout the 1970s. And in each of these duels, they would choose to either fight with swords or with magical powers. But they canceled each of these duels, right? Here's an advertisement that was handed out in tube stations to publicize their next upcoming duel on Thursday, August 18th, 1978. That duel was also canceled. All their duels were canceled, so they never actually wound up trying to kill each other with weapons. David Farrant became popular with the British tabloid press throughout the 1970s and into the 2000s due to his rituals. The press discovered that he was holding Wiccan rituals with naked women. And of course, photographs of these rituals would leak out to the press, and the newspapers would report them in their news. Right? Here is one of the more milder magazines published in the UK at that time, Tidbits, right? And it has photographs of David Farrant staging a vampire hunt with some friends of his. Right? So these are staged photographs. So he became very popular with a certain type of newspaper and magazine in the UK. Sean Manchester did not hold any ceremonies or rituals with naked women, but he did appear on TV and radio from time to time to talk about vampires from the 1970s to the 2000s. In 1974, News of the World, one of those sleaziest newspapers published in the UK, reported that David Farrant was going to sacrifice cats in a ritual that involved female virgins. I will clarify that the female virgins in question were going to be human beings and not cats. When Sean Manchester found out about this upcoming alleged ritual, he said that my opponent intends to raise a demon to destroy me by killing a cat. I will be relying solely on divine power. Well, the British public may have been entertained by David Farrant's vampire hunts and his rituals with naked women, but they were outraged that he would actually kill an innocent cat. David Farrant denied that he was ever going to sacrifice a cat or any human or any living being, and he successfully sued News of the World for libel. However, his luck would not last throughout 1974. More grave vandalism and interfering with human remains occurred in the cemetery, and he returned to Highgate Cemetery again with a crucifix and wooden stake, and he got arrested by the police again. But this time, the judge did not throw out the case. Instead, he sent David Farrant to trial, and he was subsequently convicted of damaging memorials and interfering with human remains. Farrant was sentenced to 5 years in prison and served 3 of those years. Back then, Farrant denied that he had anything to do with these grave desecrations or vandalism, and he denied he had any involvement in these acts right to the day he died. In 1985, Sean Manchester wrote the book, The Highgate Vampire, and he claimed to have followed the vampire for years. He also claimed to have finally tracked down the vampire and its black wooden coffin to an abandoned house in Crouch Head in North London. He says that at that house, he staked, beheaded, and burned the vampire in an exorcism ritual in 1977. In 1990, he told BBC Radio that the vampire had turned into a spider the size of a cat during the exorcism. I actually have listened to a recording of that radio interview. In 1991, David Farrant wrote his own account of the Highgate Vampire, Beyond the Highgate Vampire, and he claims to have traveled to Romania to investigate the vampire. The rivalry between David Farrant and Sean Manchester extended for decades. All throughout the 1970s, the 80s, the 90s, and into the 21st century, the two of them would attack and criticize each other in the media and in the newspapers. Farrant created a cartoon character called Bishop Bonkers, based on Sean Manchester, and marketed Bishop Bonkers t-shirts, mugs, and other merchandise. Here he is wearing a Bishop Bonkers t-shirt. When the internet was created in the late 20th century, both men took to the internet and attacked each other on websites, social media, and on Twitter. So they were very adept to adjusting to the modern world to carry on their feud. After almost 50 years, their feud finally ended on April 8th, 2019, when Farrant died. Sean Manchester is still alive, but he has retired from public life. That means he's no longer hunting for vampires or performing exorcisms. This is a scene from the TV series True Horror with Anthony Stewart Head. Some of you will know Anthony Stewart Head from the TV show Buffy the Vampire Slayer. In the TV series True Horror with Anthony Stewart Head, he talks about how great and wonderful it was to play Giles the librarian in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but now he's going to have a chance to meet a real vampire slayer, and then he goes off and meets Sean Manchester. For the last few decades, most of the news coming out of Highgate Cemetery has been about the grave of Karl Marx because it gets vandalized fairly frequently. However, Highgate Cemetery has hit the news again. I mean, the vampire has hit the news again. Just a couple of weeks ago, the new TV streaming service, Discovery Plus, announced that it was going to show a new documentary called The Curse of the Highgate Vampire. 2 nights from now, on Friday, October 29th. Right? This is a new documentary made in Britain, and it will be about the Highgate Vampire, David Farrant and Sean Manchester and their rivalry. And it will also include interviews with 3 British paranormal investigators who post their videos on YouTube. Right? There's a whole profession now called YouTubers. And these are people who make videos and put them on YouTube, and they find ways to monetize their videos. And within the YouTuber profession, there's a subset of YouTubers who, hunt for ghosts and hunt for vampires and visit haunted houses and graveyards. 3 of them will be in this documentary. One of them even admitted he entered Highgate Vampire illegally when it was off limits to hunt for the vampire. I have not seen this documentary yet, but I'll be sure to watch out for it on Friday night on Discovery Plus. So is the Highgate Vampire still around? Well, we'll find out whether the next generation of vampire hunters ever found the vampire. But the Highgate Cemetery vampire remains one of the most interesting incidents of vampirism in England or Britain. It's not a vampire scare from the 19th century or the 18th century. It's from a relatively recent period, the 1970s. I mean, by then, Britain was a modern country. It had just introduced decimal currency, of all things. It's really inconceivable that an advanced country would have a vampire scare in its recent history, but yet it happened. And for years, people speculated as to why the vampire scare occurred in North London in the 1970s. And of course, people have speculated on who really was performing all the vandalism and grave desecration and killing of wild animals at Highgate. My personal opinion is that this was all the work of vandals and other troublemakers, because the cemetery was unkept, wide open for vandals to enter. And we know that if places are not kept in good condition, they tend to attract troublemakers and vandals. That's my personal opinion, but as we see, other people had other opinions of what was going on at Highgate Cemetery. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening to this bit of recent modern British history. Okay.
Now, anybody got any questions for Derwin?
Yeah.
Good fun.
Well, it was a fascinating presentation.
Any questions? In the
My
chat?
question would be, what are the security arrangements at Highgate now with closed circuit TV everywhere in England? Is it there too?
Yeah, there is definitely closed circuit TV in Highgate, and especially around the grave of Karl Marx, because it's the most frequently vandalized grave there. And the Friends of Highgate Cemetery do have the funds for enhanced security. They do lock the gates at night, although I heard that one of the paranormal investigators in the new documentary managed to slip through the locked gates and enter the place illegally without permission, right? And there are other controls, like you are not permitted to just walk into the cemetery now. The Friends of Highgate Cemetery insist you buy an admission fee, so that prevents people who just want to go in there and cause trouble without paying money, right? And so it's like any other cemetery now. There's security controls, there's security guards, there's locks in the gate.
Well, thanks for the presentation. Very interesting. And the continuity, amazing.
Well, I guess your last chance to ask a question. Anybody? Yes, no, maybe? No?
Let's see
Well,
what's there any comments.
Hello.
Oh, someone's talking. Yep.
Yes, it's Eric.
Hi.
Well, I'm terribly gratified to learn that if you want to cause trouble in there now, you at least have to pay money. But what I wanted to ask was, is there any truth to the rumor that the vampire hunters are in fact the hidden hand behind QAnon?
Oh, goodness gracious, QAnon. Well, who on earth is QAnon? I know what QAnon is. I just don't know the individuals behind it. No, I have not heard that particular rumor that vampire hunters are behind QAnon. Is that the latest rumor about QAnon?
No, but I thought we could spread it.
All right. So now the RCMI is going to become the center of more conspiracy theories. Yes, yes.
Well, I mean, we've got more cornerstones than you can shake a stick at. Surely there must be a tombstone hidden in the nether reaches
of our building. We'll see.
The only trouble is they dug up our nether reaches, but
I see we refer this issue over to the museum committee to find out what is in our building and what our building was built over top of. Yes.
There's a brilliant idea.
Yeah. Someone in the chat mentioned that maybe his mother was prowling around the cemetery at night during her breaks while working as a nurse at the Whittingham Hospital in the 1960s. Yeah, that's quite possible. People do, walk through cemeteries during the daytime for recreation, because the rural, what we call the rural cemeteries, which don't necessarily mean they're out in the rural countryside. By rural cemeteries, what the British meant was that they were away from the city center. Many of the rural cemeteries were built to be used as public parks and places of leisure for the living. And indeed,
well, I live 2 blocks from the necropolis on Parliament, and while I've never seen anybody go in there with a picnic basket, it's a favorite place to take a walk.
Oh yeah. The rural cemeteries still have that purpose, right? So it's quite possible that this member's mother went strolling through there during.
Well, it's myself, Derwin. It's Hans here.
Oh, Hans, here, hi there. Yeah. I have to wear my
In fact, it was my mother who she worked just a 10-minute walk from the cemetery at the Whittington Hospital.
Yeah.
So she did used to go for a stroll, but she used to work. Certainly nurses work night shift as a nursing sister, and maybe she was prowling around late at night. Who knows? I've always thought my mom's a bit scary at times, so it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. Well, she's with the lax security available in the 1960s. At the time, she could have entered the cemetery, but as we see from all the incidents I described, entering the cemetery at night in the 1960s was definitely not recommended. Because something was going on in the cemetery. My personal opinion, it was vandals and other troublemakers entering the cemetery at night. But other people think it was a vampire or an evil ghost or a cultist or Satanist.
Maybe Alistair Crowley was seen prowling around.
Yeah, Alistair Crowley. Britain. A few years ago, I actually did an RCMI Halloween presentation about Alistair Crowley and his counterpart from the opposite side, Montague Summers. And Britain seems to have a very rich history of eccentrics who dabble in the occult, but are not necessarily harmful people. Britain's got this rich history of that.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or comments or reminiscences about Highgate?
Well,
How does one get buried there, Derwin?
How does one get buried there? Well,
You have to die.
I'll get buried there. Well,
Okay, you said this plot's still open. Can you actually? Does any denomination can be buried there, or
Oh, well, yeah. Any denomination can be buried at Highgate now, right? It's not exclusive to any denomination. The available plots that are there open to any denomination, not just Church of England. Although the majority of the old section is consecrated to Church of England, but on the other hand, there's no space left in the old section. Anyway, But the starting price for a plot there is £20,000. So it's not the cheapest plot in London. And
That's
this
a bit
is,
pricey.
yeah, this is before the price of the monument and the services such as the burial.
Hmm.
There you have it. So thank you, Derwin, for actually it was a fascinating presentation and really thought-provoking too. Very well researched.
Yes, thanks very much.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
And yeah, it was fascinating. I usually present you, with a token of appreciation at this time, but that being virtually impossible. If you'll see Executive Assistant to RCMI, Susan Cook, she has one waiting for you. So there you go. So think of another one for next year. Put your thinking cap on, and do it all again next year. Yes.
Right, well, thanks for letting me give another Halloween presentation, and everyone have a happy Halloween this weekend.
Yes. No, we did the first one, the Witches of Salem, and I was amazed at the interest, and we had a huge audience, and it took off from there. But it's been very, very interesting. Now, at this time, I'd like to acknowledge the strong support and expertise of the RCMI behind the scenes team, without which this presentation would not be possible. And for our host this evening, Margit. Thank you, Margit. And I've got one announcement. The next military history night is scheduled for November the 3rd. Topic, Days of Victory, the Liberation of the Netherlands, World War II. Speaker, Ted Barris. I invite you all to participate. Now, this presentation will be a limited live audience and Zoom platform. So that's about it, ladies and gentlemen. I now declare this meeting ended. Hope to see you all again soon. Good night.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.